picture the scene. It's Good Friday, April 23rd, the year 1014. You have this massive cinematic standoff on a coastal plain near a little fishing weir called Clontarf, which is just north of a Viking town called Dublin.
Right, a really dramatic setting.
Exactly. And on one side of this plain, you have the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru. He's aging, he's a legend, and he's facing down this terrifying, heavily armed coalition on the other side.
And, if you grew up hearing the legend or even just read a passing summary of Irish history, you probably know the story that goes with this scene.
Oh, yeah. The great foundational myth.
Right. The story goes that this was the glorious defining day where the united native Irish finally banded together and drove the foreign Viking invaders straight into the sea. They saved their nation once and for all.
Which is an amazing story. I mean,
Right.
It's pure blockbuster material. But there's just one slight problem with it.
Yeah, it is almost entirely untrue.
Welcome to our latest deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack the reality of the Norse in Ireland. Because the real story, the actual historical truth of what happened leading up to Clontarf, is so much more compelling than the myth.
It really is. I mean, it wasn't this clean-cut good guys versus bad guys, Irish versus Vikings scenario at all. It was a tangled, incredibly bloody civil war. You had Irish kings and Norse warriors fighting on both sides.
Right. And today, we're going to explore exactly how we got to that point, how the Vikings arrived and actually gave Ireland its very first towns. We'll look at the deeply entangled hybrid society they built together over 2 centuries.
We'll also track the rise of this legendary outsider king who hacked the system and, finally get to the messy human truth behind one of history's most mythologized battles.
So to really understand the sheer scale of the disruption the Vikings caused, I think we need to look at the political chessboard they landed on.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it was unlike anything they'd encountered before.
Right, because when they first arrived, we're talking late 700s, early 800s, they're doing the standard raids on undefended monasteries, places like Iona, which, we covered why monasteries were such perfect targets back when we looked at Lindisfarne in episode 17, so we don't need to rehash all that.
No, but what we do need to look at is the political landscape surrounding those monasteries in Ireland, because it was completely different from, say, Anglo-Saxon England or Francia.
Yeah, I was looking at the actual structure of it, and the level of decentralization is just staggering. I mean, trying to invade Ireland at this time would be like trying to conquer a chessboard where literally every single piece is playing for itself.
That is a great way to put it. There was no single unified state. There was no London or Winchester or Paris. The island was divided into roughly, historians estimate about 150 separate minor kingdoms.
150, that's insane for an island that size.
It is. They were called tuatha, and each tuath had its own king, Ari. But the hierarchy didn't just stop there. It was layered in this incredibly complex way.
Right, because a local king might owe allegiance to an overking, right?
Exactly, a ruiri, who then might be subject to a provincial king. And then theoretically, at the very top, you had the high king, the ardri.
But that was mostly a ceremonial title, wasn't it?
Usually, yes.
Hmm.
It carried immense prestige, but it didn't mean you had actual executive power over the whole island. You couldn't just pass a law or raise a national army.
And the succession laws made it even more chaotic, if I remember correctly. It wasn't just the oldest son takes over.
Oh, not at all. They used a system based on the Derbfine, which is essentially a 4-generation kinship group. Basically, any male who shared a great-grandfather with a reigning king was eligible to succeed him.
Wow. So you've got this built-in recipe for constant civil war.
Precisely. You didn't just have to defend your borders from the kingdom next door. You had to watch your back against your cousins, your uncles, half-brothers. The entire economy and political structure were based on localized dominance. Cattle raiding, taking hostages, demanding tribute from your immediate neighbors.
Which explains so much about why the standard Viking playbook just completely failed here.
It really did.
Because think about what we saw them do in England. The great heathen army marches into Northumbria, or East Anglia. They corner the king, they kill him, they take the capital, and boom, they've decapitated the leadership, and they just slide right into the existing administrative machinery.
They take over the state. But in Ireland, there was no head to cut off.
Right.
If a Viking warlord rolls up and kills a local Ree, he hasn't conquered Ireland. He hasn't even conquered a province. He's just created a localized power vacuum in one out of 150 kingdoms.
And immediately you've got 5 cousins from the Derbfine stepping up to fight him, plus all the neighboring kings who see an opportunity to grab some land.
Exactly. It was a geopolitical tar pit for the Vikings. They couldn't conquer the island using their traditional shock and awe tactics, so they had to pivot.
They realize they can't just raid and leave or conquer the whole thing. They have to become players on this incredibly messy board.
Right. And to do that, they have to stick around.
Huh.
Which leads us to, arguably, the greatest, most enduring legacy they left in Ireland.
The town.
The towns. Because here is a massive paradox about early medieval Ireland. They had this brilliant, sophisticated culture, these incredibly wealthy monastic settlements creating breathtaking art, but they had absolutely zero towns.
Not at all.
None. The society was entirely rural. There were no permanent commercial urban centers where people lived densely packed together purely for trade and manufacture. The Vikings brought the concept of the town to Ireland.
And the mechanics of how that started are just fascinating to me. It wasn't this grand planned urbanization project. It started with practicality.
Pure pragmatism, yeah.
In the 840s, the Norse basically realized that sailing all the way back to Scandinavia every single winter with their loot is just highly inefficient and dangerous.
So they invent the long fort.
Right, the ship camp. They find a protected spot on a river, haul those long ships up onto the bank, and we've already covered why those shallow draft ships were such a tactical nightmare for their enemies, and they build an earthen bank and a wooden palisade around them.
Just a fortified winter camp.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the most famous of these long forts was built on the River Liffey, right next to this dark tidal pool. And the Irish name for that dark pool was Dublin.
Which, of course, gives us Dublin. And what's amazing is how quickly that temporary military encampment exploded into a massive, permanent urban center.
Because they had to survive the winter, right? They couldn't just sit behind a wooden wall for 6 months.
No, they had to eat. They needed timber for ship repairs. So they had to start interacting with the local Irish kingdoms. They started trading for cattle and grain. They started forging political alliances to protect their camp.
And eventually that turns into intermarrying with the local elite.
Yes, and before you know it, Dublin transitions from a pirate base into this booming, industrialized, international trading hub.
And it wasn't just Dublin, which is the crazy part. They essentially mapped out modern urban Ireland. Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick, all of these major coastal cities were founded by the Norse as these fortified trading hubs.
They systematically locked down the major river estuaries. They hardwired this rural, isolated island directly into the broader European economy.
But we do have to talk about what exactly they were trading. Because to understand how Dublin grew so powerful so fast, you have to look at the primary commodity.
Yeah, we can't gloss over this. It's a very dark reality.
Viking Dublin was one of the major slave trading hubs of the entire Western world.
It was a massive industrialized operation.
And, we cover the origins of the Viking slave trade and even where the word slave comes from back in episode 7, so listeners are familiar with the institution itself. But what happened in Ireland seems uniquely brutal because of how it tied into the existing political system.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Vikings didn't just raid for captives themselves. They tapped directly into that internal Irish warfare we were just talking about.
The constant raiding between the Tuatha.
Exactly. When these rival Irish kingdoms fought, they traditionally took captives, usually for ransom or localized forced labor. But suddenly, the Norse in Dublin are sitting there offering a bottomless, highly lucrative international market for human beings.
So an Irish king captures a bunch of rival warriors or peasants from a neighboring kingdom, and instead of just holding them, he can march them down to Dublin and monetize them.
He sells them to the Norse for hex silver or imported Frankish weapons or luxury goods, and Dublin becomes this great western funnel.
Captives from across Ireland and even from raids over in Britain are brought to Dublin, held in these massive slave pens right in the middle of the town, and then loaded onto long ships.
And from there, they are pushed into the vast Viking commercial network, down through the Russian rivers, all the way to the markets of the Islamic world, the Byzantine Empire.
It's human trafficking on an intercontinental scale, operating right out of the Liffey estuary.
It is, and it presents this incredible historical duality. These people are the progressive founders of Ireland's urban infrastructure. They're building roads and minting the first Irish coins, but they're also running a massive slave economy.
It's a level of moral complexity that I think older textbooks really struggled with. They wanted heroes and villains. But I'll tell you who doesn't shy away from it. the modern TV adaptations.
Oh, the Netflix shows.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you watch how they portray Viking settlements, whether it's Dublin or Kattegat, it's not a sanitized, cartoonish world. It's incredibly gritty.
They do a surprisingly good job of showing that duality.
They really do.
Yeah.
You see this bustling cosmopolitan town. You've got merchants selling spices from the east. You've got brilliant shipwrights crafting these incredible vessels. It looks vibrant and alive. But then, right in the middle of the frame, literally sharing a wall with the blacksmith, is a wooden cage full of enslaved people waiting to be shipped off.
It perfectly captures how normalized the brutality was. The slave trade ran right through the heart of their economy. It wasn't hidden away, it was the engine.
And the incredible thing is, we don't just have to rely on sagas or annals to know what this bustling, brutal world looked like. It wasn't just left in the history books.
No, it was literally buried beneath the modern capital.
This is where the story gets so cool for me, because the archaeology here is just mind-blowing. Let's talk about woodquay.
Yes. The woodquay excavations in the 1970s and 80s, this is one of the most important urban digs in European history.
So set the scene for us. The city of Dublin wants to build new civic offices.
Right. They pick a site right along the River Liffey, right in the heart of the old medieval city. And as soon as the excavators break ground, they hit something extraordinary. They hit the water table.
Which turns the dirt into mud.
Exactly. Deep, dark, waterlogged mud.
Mm-hmm.
And for archaeologists, that mud is a miracle. I actually always compare this directly to the Coppergate dig in Jorvik, Viking York, which we covered recently in episode 23.
Oh, right. The twin Viking towns of the Irish Sea.
Yes. Both of them were resurrected by dirt and water because that damp, waterlogged soil creates an anaerobic environment. It seals out the oxygen.
So the bacteria that normally breaks down organic stuff just can't survive.
Which means the Viking Age didn't rot away. It was preserved like a geological time capsule.
They didn't just find, like, stone foundations and a few rusty axes.
Oh, no. They found the entire organic fabric of the city. We're talking thousands of leather shoes, wooden bowls, bone combs, vast amounts of discarded textiles, and, most importantly, the actual timber foundations of the Norse post and wattle houses.
It's like Pompeii, but with mud instead of ash.
It really is. And because the wood was so perfectly preserved, they could use dendrochronology tree ring dating to map the city's growth.
That's where they match the tree rings to the historical climate records. Right?
Exactly. So they could literally say, this specific oak tree was chopped down in the spring of the year 924 to build this specific wall. They reconstructed the exact property boundaries, which, amazingly, still matched the modern street layout of Dublin.
That gives me chills.
And, of course, they excavated the cesspits, the Viking toilets.
Always the best place for treasure.
Truly. Because analyzing the coprolites, the fossilized human waste gave us their exact diet. We found evidence of blackberries, hazelnuts, wheat, and, unsurprisingly, a massive, massive amount of intestinal parasites.
So it was a loud, bustling, incredibly smelly, highly productive city.
A completely sensory overload, yeah.
But here is where the story takes this crazy, dramatic twist. Because despite all these priceless discoveries, the city of Dublin still wanted to pave over the site.
They did. They had plans for these massive concrete civic offices, and they weren't going to let a 1,000-year-old Viking town get in the way.
Which triggered an unprecedented public outcry.
The Save Woodquay campaign.
Right. I mean, you had tens of thousands of modern Dubliners taking to the streets. They marched, they held rallies, they literally occupied the muddy trenches to stop the bulldozers.
It was a massive civil rights-style protest, but for medieval archaeology.
But wait, let's look at this objectively for a second. Why did a modern Irish public care so much about a bunch of old Viking timbers? Because, logically, isn't there a huge contradiction there?
How do you mean?
Well, these protesters are fiercely defending the legacy of foreign colonizers. Men who burned their native monasteries and built a massive slave economy. Why weren't they happy to pave over the colonizers' camp?
That is the crucial question, and it cuts right to the heart of what happened to the Norse in Ireland. The protesters didn't view the Vikings as foreign colonizers anymore.
They viewed them as ancestors.
Exactly. You have to remember the context. For centuries, Dublin had been the center of British colonial rule in Ireland, the Pale. Woodquay proved that Dublin's roots were significantly older, deeper, and completely distinct from English colonization. The modern citizens of Dublin looked down into those muddy trenches and fiercely claimed those Norse founders as their own.
Because the Vikings didn't remain isolated invaders. They wove themselves directly into the island's DNA.
They absolutely did. And the word we use for that incredible deep entanglement is the Gall Gael.
The Gall Gael, the foreigner Irish.
Yes, it's a completely hybrid culture that emerged in the century or so leading up to the Battle of Clontarf. The lines just completely blurred.
And how did that happen, practically speaking? I mean, beyond just trading goods back and forth.
It happened through deep structural alliances and specifically through the Irish custom of fosterage.
Oh, fosterage. That's where you send your kids to be raised by another family.
Right. It was a very common way to seal a political alliance or a peace treaty in Ireland. You wouldn't just sign a parchment, you'd exchange sons.
Wow.
So you had these situations where an Irish prince from a rural Tuath would be sent to live in a Norse household in Dublin. He'd grow up learning Old Norse, understanding their naval tactics, maybe even exposed to their pantheon of gods early on.
And vice versa. A Norse prince would be sent out to the country.
Exactly. A Viking leader's son would be raised in an Irish royal ringfort. He'd learn Gaelic, he'd learn the complexities of Brehon law, he'd listen to Irish poetry. Add to that the constant strategic intermarriage between the elite families, and within 2 generations, the leadership of Dublin was culturally bilingual.
They were genetically and culturally a brand new thing.
The Gall Gael. They wore Norse-style silver arm rings but spoke Gaelic. They fought with Viking battle axes but understood the nuances of Irish succession laws.
And militarily, they became a crucial asset on that chessboard we talked about.
Right.
Because the Irish kings quickly realized, hey, I don't just have to fight these guys, I can hire them.
Exactly. Dublin and the other Norse towns essentially operated as heavily armed independent city-states. If you were a provincial Irish king looking to crush a rival, hiring a fleet of Norse mercenaries from Dublin was a brilliant tactical move.
It was a very pragmatic, if chaotic, system.
It was, and that system hummed along full of shifting alliances and localized warfare until one man decided he was going to break the board entirely.
Enter Brian Boru.
Brian Boru, the great disruptor of Irish history.
So who is he? Where does he come from? Because he wasn't supposed to rule the whole island, was he?
Not at all. He was born in the 10th century into the Dáil Cais, which was a relatively minor, though newly powerful dynasty down in Munster in the southwest of Ireland.
Okay, so he's a southern king.
Right. And historically, the title of High King, the Ard Rí, had been fiercely monopolized by the Uí Néill dynasties up in the north. It was basically an ancient closed club. If you were from Munster, you did not get to be High King.
But Brian had other plans.
He had relentless ambition, and he was a tactical genius. He realized that to dominate Ireland, you couldn't just play the old game of cattle raiding and hostage-taking. And crucially, he learned from the Vikings.
He looked at what made them successful.
Exactly. He saw that water-based mobility was the ultimate weapon. You can't control Ireland by marching armies slowly through bogs and dense forests.
So what does he do?
He builds a massive naval fleet of his own. He uses Norse-style longships, often employing Norse-Irish shipwrights and sailors, and he deploys them on the River Shannon.
The Shannon being the massive waterway that basically cuts right through the center of the island.
Right. By controlling the Shannon, Brian Boru could project military power deep into the territories of his northern rivals at unprecedented speeds. He weaponized the Norse infrastructure against the traditional Irish powers.
It's brilliant. And, looking at his trajectory, the comparisons to other great unifier kings we've covered in this series are just unavoidable.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, he is the Irish equivalent of Alfred the Great in Wessex, who we talked about in episode 16. Alfred faced a fractured land and a massive Viking threat, and he used the burr system to centralize power. Or even King Canute from episode 15, an outsider who used sheer naval dominance to unite England, Denmark, and Norway.
It's the exact same archetype. Brian Boru used naval mobility and a hybrid military strategy to force central authority onto a deeply decentralized landscape.
And he actually pulls it off.
He does. Through decades of relentless campaigning, making alliances, breaking alliances, and subjugating rivals, he shatters the ancient Uí Néill monopoly. He becomes the undisputed Ard Rí, the High King of all Ireland. And not just a name, he exercises genuine, practical authority.
But in history, when you impose rigid central order on a system that is naturally decentralized and chaotic, you build up pressure.
Tremendous pressure.
And that pressure is what finally detonates on Good Friday, 1014, the Battle of Clontarf.
Right. Because Brian's dominance alienated a lot of very powerful people.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because this is where we completely deconstruct that myth we started the show with, the whole united Irish rising up against the Viking invaders narrative. How did this battle actually start?
It started as a rebellion against Brian Boru's taxation and dominance, and the rebellion was led by an Irish king, Mal Morda, the king of Leinster.
Leinster being the wealthy province on the east coast, right next to Dublin.
Exactly. Mal Morda resented being a vassal to Brian, so he rises up. But he knows his Leinster forces aren't enough to beat the High King's massive army, so who does he turn to? His immediate neighbor and ally, Sigtryg Silkbeard, the Norse-Irish king of Dublin.
So the anti-Brian coalition is already a mix of native Irish and Dublin Norse.
Yes. But even together, they are outmatched. So Sigtryg Silkbeard taps into the international Viking network. He sends envoys across the sea, to the Orkney Islands, to the Isle of Man, and he hires thousands of heavily armored Viking mercenaries to sail to Ireland and fight for the rebellion.
Okay, so that's the rebel side, Irish from Leinster, Norse from Dublin, and Viking mercenaries from overseas. What about Brian Boru's side? Was his army a pure native Gaelic resistance?
Not even close. Brian's army was mostly his own forces from Munster, yes, but he also had extensive contingents of Norse warriors fighting for him.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. Vikings from the towns of Limerick and Waterford, and even rival Norse factions from within Dublin who opposed Sigtryg were standing in the High King's shield wall.
So you literally had Irishmen killing Irishmen and Norsemen killing Norsemen.
Exactly. It was a brutally pragmatic struggle for regional political supremacy. Ethnicity had very little to do with it.
And to really grasp just how tangled and messy this was, we have to talk about Gormlaith.
Ah, Gormlaith.
Ah.
She is the ultimate embodiment of this era's complexity.
She is incredible. She's this powerful, aristocratic, Irish noblewoman, the sister of Mal Morda, the rebellious king of Leinster.
Right.
But she had previously been married to the Norse king of Dublin and was the mother of Sigtryg Silkbeard.
Yeah.
And this is the kicker. She had also been married to Brian Boru himself.
It is absolute soap opera level entanglement.
Now, I know the later Norse sagas, like Njál's saga, really lean into this idea that she was a bitter, vindictive ex-wife who just manipulated everyone into starting this massive war purely to destroy Brian Boru.
Right, that's the classic literary trope of the goading woman. The sagas love a wicked queen. But if you strip away the misogyny and look at the historical reality, she represents the absolute biological merging of these elite families. She was the central node connecting the Irish Rebellion, the Dublin Norse, and the High King.
They weren't fighting some anonymous foreign invader. They were fighting their in-laws.
They were fighting their brothers-in-law, their stepsons, their former allies. The lines of us versus them simply did not exist.
Which brings us to the actual battle. The morning of Good Friday. Tens of thousands of men facing off near the sea at Clontarf. What did the fighting actually look like?
It was terrifying. We are talking about massive, overlapping shield walls. Phalanx warfare. The accounts describe it as a grueling, day-long meat grinder, from sunrise to sunset, without a break.
Just hours of close-quarters infantry combat.
Right. Axes, spears, swords, the sheer physical compression of thousands of bodies crushing into each other. You would have heard Gaelic war cries mixing with Old Norse shouts, the sound of iron on wood. It was incredibly bloody.
But eventually, the sheer numerical weight and discipline of Brian's Munster forces begin to turn the tide, right?
They do. They slowly brine down the Leinster-Norse coalition, and eventually the rebel lines break.
And because they are backed up against the sea and the River Tolka, it turns into a complete disaster for the rebels.
A massacre. Thousands of Leinster Irish and Dublin Norse are cut down as they try to run. Many of the heavily armored Viking mercenaries drown under the weight of their own chainmail trying to reach their longships in the bay.
So tactically, it is a total, unmitigated victory for Brian Boru. He crushes the rebellion.
He does. But the victory comes with a legendary, tragic cost.
Because Brian wasn't actually fighting, was he?
No, he was in his 70s at this point. Far too old to be swinging a sword in a shield wall. So he was stationed at the rear of his army, waiting in his tent, praying.
And as the rebel army is fleeing, this small contingent of Viking mercenaries from the Isle of Man, led by a warlord named Brodir, gets lost in the woods while trying to escape the slaughter.
And by pure terrible chance, they stumble directly upon the High King's encampment.
Oh, wow.
Brodier recognizes the banners. He realizes that the guards are either dead or they've all rushed forward to join the pursuit of the routed enemy. And there, in the tent, is Brian Boru, defenseless.
In the absolute climax of his life's ambition.
Exactly. Brodier crashes into the tent and assassinates the great unifier, cutting him down with an axe.
It's so deeply cinematic. He wins the battle that secures his eternal legacy, but loses his life in the exact same hour.
It really is. And going back to the modern portrayals we talked about earlier, this incredibly blurry, chaotic reality where an old man dies in a tent while his army slaughters his ex-wife's brother and his former Norse allies is exactly the kind of complex, gray area historical drama that makes for great television.
The reality is vastly superior to the simplified myth.
Always. It's a story of political ambition, tangled loyalties, and the devastating price of power.
So what does this all mean? If we look at the aftermath, if the myth is false, if Clontarf wasn't a war of national liberation and the native Irish didn't miraculously drive the Vikings into the sea, what actually happened the next day?
Well, functionally, the political system just reset.
It went back to normal.
Pretty much. With Brian Boru and his immediate heirs dead on the battlefield, the strong central authority he had violently imposed just evaporated. The High Kingship reverted to being a highly contested, largely hollow title. The Tuatha resumed their internal feuds. Ireland fragmented once again.
And the Norse. What happened to the Vikings in Dublin?
They woke up the next morning, buried their dead, and went back to work.
It's just like that.
Just like that.
Yeah.
Sigtryg Silkbeard, who had very prudently stayed safely inside the walled city of Dublin during the battle, continued to rule for another 20 years.
Wow. He survived it all.
He did. The Vikings weren't expelled because there was no Scandinavia for them to return to. Dublin was their home. They had lived there for generations. The city continued to thrive as a wealthy, hybridized commercial center.
Which ties perfectly into the recurring theme of our entire series. When you look at the macro timeline of the Viking Age, their ultimate destination is almost always absorption.
Precisely. The separate Viking identity in Ireland didn't end with a dramatic military defeat. It ended with a slow biological and cultural fade. Over the subsequent centuries, the Gaelgaels simply merged entirely with the surrounding Gaelic culture. They adopted the language fully, they integrated into the evolving political structures, and they became Irish.
So when we strip away the 19th century nationalist romanticism, the actual lasting legacy of the Norse in Ireland isn't a story of a conquered nation bravely casting out its oppressors.
Not at all.
The legacy is the very map of modern urban Ireland. It's the DNA of the Gaelgael still coursing through the population. It's the maritime trade routes and the physical streets of Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. Those cities are the massive living monuments of the Viking Age.
And that leaves us with a profoundly fascinating thought to ponder. Think about how a nation constructs its identity. Ireland's foundational patriotic myth, a story explicitly designed to celebrate native purity and the casting out of the foreigner, was built upon a battle where those so-called foreigners were actually neighbors, in-laws, and vital economic partners.
Yeah.
It just shows how later generations will willingly smooth out history. They sacrifice the beautiful, messy complexity of the truth just to build a simple, cohesive narrative of us versus them.
The messy truth is always a better story.
I completely agree.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the deeply entangled, fiercely complicated history of the Norse and the Irish. But our journey through the Viking world is far from over. Next time, we are crossing the sea to uncover the deepest, most permanent mark the Vikings left anywhere on the planet.
We are heading into the Danelaw.
That's right. We're going to explore how the Vikings completely, biologically, and linguistically rewired England. We will break down the mechanics of the hundreds of everyday English words that are secretly Old Norse in origin, the thousands of Viking place names that still dictate the map today, and the lingering Viking bloodlines hardwired into the English people. It is the legacy you speak every single day. You won't want to miss it. Keep following the journey with us.